Breathe in peace. Breathe out love. Breathe in peace. Breathe out love. And I want you to pay attention to what's going on in your body today, right now, and for the rest of the day. How's your heart? How's your throat? Your shoulders? Your belly? Do you have any aches or pains or tightness? Maybe breathe more into those places. At any point today and at any point in life, we can just breathe. I am Steve Cooper, Director of Religious Education here at this church. Last fall, I attended a national conference for religious educators, and one of the workshops that I attended is the one that I'm about to offer. The workshop was facilitated by Alex Capitan, and Z is a member and co-leader of the Transforming Hearts Collective, which is a healing justice group. The Transforming Hearts Collective are working to make spaces for more spirituality and resilience for queer and trans folks with multiple marginalized identities, both inside and outside of organized religion. Knowing that our church was starting the process of working with the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee to help queer and trans folks in the Chicago area, I asked Alex if I could share this workshop with the congregation. And we are also offering a Pronouns 101 workshop in a couple weeks and a 6-session trans inclusion in your congregation workshop that is provided by the Transforming Hearts Collective that we hope to pique your interest into joining. And I will speak more of this later. I started with the breathing exercise because a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is the hard stuff. It's about debunking some myths and looking at the political climate for people that are trans and queer. I'm going to speak to the political landscape that we find ourselves in right now relative to trans rights and how we got here, because it's kind of overwhelming. It happened very fast, and a lot of folks have no idea where we are and why. What we are experiencing right now is nothing less than an all-out assault on the very existence of trans people in the United States. Anti-trans rhetoric is sweeping the airwaves, and anti-trans bills and laws are sweeping legislature across the country at an unbelievable pace. And as many of you know, and many of you have experienced, trans people have been seized upon by the far right as a winning social issue. Trans people are a winning social issue that can energize the rights base and fracture their opposition. It is important to name this is part of a trifecta of social issues that has energized and been pushed by the far right in the last couple of years. Anti-abortion, anti-critical race theory, and trans people, particularly trans youth. This is a trifecta. And we're seeing that happening very consistently as a strategy. So, as Ezra Klein, who is a progressive journalist and political analyst, said recently after attending CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, and he was reporting out on that conference, and he said the right's aim is to use the power of the state to eradicate the ability of trans people to live as themselves in public or to be able to become themselves. And I want to share one more quote, which is from Sarah Longwell, who is a Republican strategist, but one that is critical of Trump, who very early on in the current wave that we're experiencing named that anti-trans bills are actually PR campaigns masquerading as legislation, designed to keep the quote-unquote culture wars at the center of the conversation. So even folks across the political spectrum are recognizing that this is not real. There is no actual threat here. It's just noise. It's a PR campaign playing with people's lives. So where are we and how did we get here? So I have a little timeline for you. And obviously, systemic oppression of trans people dates back generations. Oppression is not new, but what we're seeing right now in terms of the aggressive going after trans people in legislation across the United States is unprecedented. So I want to talk about the modern timeline that has led to this current political moment in the United States relative to trans people. And the crisis we are experiencing isn't fully known to a lot of folks, and many of those who do know about it are experiencing a sense of confusion over what is happening and how the heck it happened so fast. So part of this is due to the fact that it's so tempting to believe that history and progress is linear, that there's a steady march forward getting better rather than a sine wave of progress and backlash and progress and backlash and progress and backlash. But it's not like that. Progress is not as linear as people want to believe. So the current story starts in 2015 when the U.S. Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage. And what happened was the entities that had been fighting same-sex marriage decided to pivot and target trans people. It was a very intentional decision. And the first wave of anti-trans state bills arrived most famously at HB 2 in North Carolina in 2016, which banned trans people from using public bathrooms that match who they are. Now what happened, as many of you might remember, was that HB 2 in North Carolina had a huge backlash. There were corporate boycotts to the tune of millions of dollars. The state actually lost $3+ billion in revenue because of these boycotts. And the state Republican governor lost his re-election. And the bill was ultimately partially repealed and by now has expired, which is good. In May 2016, when Obama was still president, the U.S. Department of Education and Department of Justice issued guidance to public schools that Title IX protects trans students. And of course, that guidance was immediately overturned by Trump's administration. In light of this moment, in 2016, the right wing decided the so-called bathroom bills were a losing strategy. It didn't work in North Carolina. And a better strategy would be to go after trans youth. They did research on this, and they found out that this would be a winning message. And they decided to start with athletes, specifically after a firestorm of racist, transphobic vitriol in 2018 when two black trans teen women, Terry Miller and Andrea Yearwood, won state high school track titles in Connecticut. They noticed that people were tweeting about this. Trump was tweeting about this. Athletes are a winning topic. Trans kids in sports are a winning topic. Trans girls, particularly in sports. And so by 2019, far-right politicians had started campaigning on the topic of trans girls in sports. For example, in the Kentucky governor's race that year, a conservative super PAC spent $600,000 on ads that argued that Democrat Andy Beshear was a threat to women's sport. That was really the beginning of the current wave. In March of 2020, Idaho became the first state to ban trans girls and women from participating in women's sports. And then leading up to the 2020 election, after being split on whether anti-LGBTQ campaigning was a winning or losing strategy, the Trump wing of the Republican Party decided to go all in. They weren't sure at first, but after they saw how well this topic was doing with their base, they spent millions of dollars in swing states on ads claiming that Democrats threatened women's sports. Meanwhile, in June of 2020, the Supreme Court ruled that being fired for being gay or trans counts as sex discrimination under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act in Bostock versus Clayton County, which honestly, a lot of folks on the left were just sort of like, phew, we dodged that bullet. Otherwise, it would have been a huge step backwards. At the same time, the right was freaking out because this was the first time that Title VII had been interpreted this way by an entity at this level of our country. So this is now the legal standard that sex discrimination protects people on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And that's a big deal. And on the first day in office, President Biden issued an executive order that, under the same reasoning, protects sex discrimination, including Title IX. Laws that prohibit sex discrimination, including Title IX, also prohibit discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. So the right is freaking out even more now. Trump had not been reelected, and there's a lot going on for the far right, which means that in 2021, that became the inflection point for anti-trans bills being proposed in state legislature across the country. And this is what led us to where we're at now. This is why in 2021 we started to see an exponential increase in these sorts of bills. In 2021 and 2022, 30 states considered anti-trans sports ban laws, and 15 enacted them. And when the first of these laws were not met with the same sort of resistance as the HB 2 bill in North Carolina a few years before, it emboldened them to go even further. So you can see in this chart, the lower color, the brightest color, is bathroom and sports. And you can see bathroom and sports sort of as the leading the way. They were the gateway. And then we see more and more types of bills start to take off. And what happened in 2022, we saw a crop of increasingly frightening draconian bills, which did things like banning best practice medical care for trans youth, legally enshrining definitions of man and woman in law, in addition to blocking trans athletes from sports. We also saw censoring discussions of LGBTQ people and issues in schools, and carving out religious exemptions for discrimination, and making emergency changes to state law to deny non-binary ID documents. And then came 2023, when the floodgates really opened. And this chart only goes through October of 2023. So as of October, more than 500 anti-trans bills had been proposed last year in virtually every single U.S. state. And as of October, 83 of them have passed into law in 23 states. and some states have seen a staggering number of bills proposed. So, for example, in Wisconsin, there were 6 bills proposed versus 65 in Texas. So just through October, 65 anti-trans bills were proposed in Texas in 2023. And we can see the sorts of bills that were proposed last year. For example, 135 healthcare anti-trans bills, 89 school and education-related ones, 60 bills about youth sports, 40 about drag performance, 25 about public facilities, public accommodations, 20 about ID updates, 6 that are about prohibiting non-discrimination towards trans folk, and then 38 random other ones that are a real amazing crop. These bills have gone further and further. In addition to just the sheer categories of the kinds of bills we're seeing, it's also the text of the bills, what they are seeking to do. So for example, Wyoming's SF 011 proposes to define trans medical care as child abuse. In Oklahoma's SB 129 proposes to ban trans medical care up to age 26 and proposes charging any physicians who provide such care with felonies in addition to losing their medical license. There have been at least 35 anti-trans bills proposed on the federal level last year. And this is new, including a bill that seeks to erase trans recognition by the federal government and enshrine sex assigned at birth as the permanent definition of women or men. And this bill is titled the Bill of Women's Rights. Trans children and youth are seen as a wedge issue in multiple ways. And one of the ways that wedge is being used is to open the door wider and wider for legislation that targets all trans people. So as bad it is right now for trans youth, the clear progression that we can see with what's happening right now is that we start with things like sports bans, school facility regulations, and quote-unquote parental right laws. And if you've heard this language, parental rights is about keeping teachers at school from being able to do things like respect kids' pronouns and names and talk about gender or read kids' books that might possibly have a character in them who isn't white, straight, cis, and all the rest. So if we start with those sorts of bills that are all about restricting queer and trans content, and then we expand from there into laws that eradicate the ability of all trans people to exist in public or even exist as their true selves. So I have this handy map, which was created by Aaron Reed, who for the last 3 years has been doing intense analysis of all the political threats to trans people in the U.S. and helping trans and queer people and families understand what's going on and the risk levels at the state level, state by state. So as you can see from Aaron's map, and this is from September of 2023, almost half of the U.S. states have passed laws or enacted policies banning or restricting best practice medical care for trans youth. But this is a state-by-state map that's about risks for adults. So these bills are targeting trans youth, trans adults, parents, medical providers, teachers, and some of them carry consequences for any person who aids and abets a trans youth in accessing care. And some of them carry felony convictions, fines, and the loss of medical license for providers, as I mentioned before. In terms of the risk to trans adults as gender-affirming health care is targeted, With an ever-expanding focus, trans people of all ages are at risk of losing access to care. For example, we can see Florida as the state that is pushing the front line of how far you can go. And we know other states are going to follow suit because it has worked. On the state level, Florida is unquestionably the worst place to be trans in the United States right now. But an example of how this expansion works is that SB 254 in Florida, which was passed earlier last year, targeted trans youth, but they slipped in a bunch of restrictions that affect gender-affirming care for people of all ages, including a ban on nurse practitioners administrating care. 80% of the providers of gender-affirming care for adults have been forced to stop providing care because of the restrictions. And many trans people of all ages have been forced to flee the state just in order to access care that they have been receiving for years and years. And there are other states, for example, that have extended their gender-affirming care bans for youth to people of all ages who are incarcerated. So you can see how these sort of bills start to add restrictions and then end up affecting people of all ages. Another good example of that expansion can be seen in the so-called bathroom bills. And this is a good example of how targeting youth has succeeded in creating space to target all trans people. So despite the failure of House Bill 2 in North Carolina in 2016, the far right has ridden the current wave of bills to pass new such laws. By starting with laws that force K through 12 schools to have restrictions on bathrooms and facility use. Students in those schools have to use bathrooms that are aligned with the sex that they were assigned at birth. And 7 states now have those laws, but North Dakota, as an example of the leading edge, went further in passing a law that extends those restrictions to universities in the state. And Florida and Kansas have passed total bathroom bills that are even worse than SB 2 in North Carolina. And Florida's laws carries the possibility of 1 year in prison for using a bathroom that doesn't match your sex assigned at birth. There's also been this huge increase in drag bans, as we saw in the previous slide. And these drag bans are awful because a lot of them are so restrictive that they start to go into the territory of not wearing cross-gender clothing. We're literally seeing a resurge of laws that we had in the 50s and 60s that restricted how people dress. So that's the risk for adults. This is the risk for youth. All the states that were a little bit risky for adults are very, very risky for youth because of how they are being targeted. As before, almost half of the U.S. states have banned best practice medical care for youth. And some of these bans include exceptions for youth who are already receiving treatment. Some of them don't, which means that youth who are currently receiving care like puberty blockers and hormone treatment are being forced to detransition. And it's also not just bans on gender-affirming care. Some laws and policies are mandating a form of conversion therapy. There were guidelines released by the Nebraska Department of Health and Human Services last year that mandate enormous barriers and restrictions on care for trans youth, including at least 5 months of non-affirming care. So some groups are now arguing that trans people in the United States meet the United Nations criteria for internally displaced refugees. It's terrible. But there are good things happening. As you can see from both of these maps, there are 13 states plus DC that have moved to put active protection or shield laws in place to protect trans people. And many of these states have actually expanded access to care. And states like Colorado, Hawaii, Maryland, and Washington offer refugee protections for people fleeing states with anti-trans laws. And of course, people are showing up for trans folk everywhere. Everyone from lawmakers like Senator Michaela Cavanaugh of Nebraska, who held a 3-week filibuster last spring to try to block the passage of 2 anti-trans bills there. And hundreds and thousands of people have testified against these bills in chambers across the U.S. Legal organizations like Transgender Law Center and the ACLU, who are fighting them tirelessly tooth and nail, filing injunctions and lawsuits. So that's what I want to share about the legislative landscape. We got through that. But I don't want to assume that we're all on the same page when it comes to the larger cultural conversations that are happening right now about trans people. And I also don't want anyone to feel a sense of shame for feeling a sense of whiplash or having questions or experiencing confusion, particularly in light of the onslaught of anti-trans rhetoric, some of which is super overt, but a lot of which is more subtle. I want to go through some facts that can counter some of the myths that are really particularly prevalent right now, mostly so that you have this information, but so you can share it with people who may be more susceptible to anti-trans rhetoric. So first fact, gender diversity is real. This is a fact. The myth is that biology is binary and dictates gender. That myth basically says that there's no such thing as transness because biology determines who you are. This is a myth, but it's a super prevalent one because it's very foundational to the systems of oppression. So the facts here are that biology isn't binary. What humans think of, or at least what a lot of us have been taught about, what biological sex means is actually a collection of at least 5 distinct biological characteristics, all of which are variable. And there's still not much we know about how they actually work and how they interact. But it's simply not true that all of humanity can be neatly divided into Model M and Model F factory settings. Intersex people are real and are varied in terms of the ways in which their biological traits show up and interact. So, if biology isn't binary, of course, gender isn't binary. People's varying biological traits inform their understanding and expression of who they are, and so do tons of different environmental factors. So, nature versus nurture is another entirely false binary. We know both are true, nature and nurture. It is extremely useful to systems of oppression to convince people that women are naturally, scientifically, biologically inferior to men in 1,000 different ways, and then the project of sorting all of humanity into 2 completely distinct, non-overlapping models, and then systemically disempowering one of those models relative to the other, and it has been an extremely effective tool of oppression. So it comes down to this. Every time we can affirm that chromosomes do not determine a person's aptitude for math or cooking or parenthood or politics, and that hormones do not determine whether someone is best suited to fly the plane or to serve coffee in that plane, and genitals should not be the arbiter of whether a person has a right to bodily autonomy. Every time we do these things, we are fighting against the message that women and femininity are inherently less valuable ways of being. Fact number two. Fact number two is that people who don't fit into that Model M versus Model F conception of sex and gender have always been there. Trans and non-binary people are not new. This is not a new thing. But of course, there's this huge myth that is escalating out there that identifying as trans or non-binary is a fad. That there are suddenly non-binary kids everywhere. And this is a thing that people are seeing, and it's understandable to be like, well, what could this possibly have come from? And to have questions about that. But the truth is that trans and non-binary people have always existed. So with the rise of mass media, and then the internet, and then social media, they have been able to find each other and recognize themselves and claim their truths more and more publicly. And a number of folks, including trans scholar Julia Serrano, they pointed out that during the 20th century, there was a huge rise in left-handedness in Western countries. Some incidents of left-handedness increased from 2% to 13%. So were people suddenly identifying as left-handed because it was trendy? No, they were actually more left-handed people, and there was decreased stigma against being left-handed and less forcing of people to be right-handed. Raise your hand if you were forced to be right-handed. We're obviously not seeing it as much anymore, but it's still out there. Fact number three. Gender-affirming medical care is well established, safe, and life-saving. It is also difficult to access. So the myth, of course, is that trans kids and youth are rushing irreversible, dangerous health decisions like surgery. And the fact is, this myth is a flat-out lie that is being heavily promoted by right-wing anti-trans propaganda. No children are having trans-related genital surgeries. No children are having any trans-related surgeries. It is extremely difficult for young people to access trans-affirming care of any kind, particularly care related to medical transition. And extremely rarely, after years of therapy and other forms of support, an older teenager is able to access what is called top surgery, which is the process of removing or reducing breast tissue. But the current standards do not allow for what's called lower surgery. What's important to know and to share with others in respect to what transition means, we need to know what transition means for children, for teens, and for adults. And the best way to support the youngest trans kids among us is to allow them to do what's called social transition. All this means is letting them wear the clothes they want, have the haircut they want, how they use their name and pronouns that make them feel good. plus getting them access to therapy to help them assess and mitigate their gender dysphoria, which can be a serious debility. So, yeah, it's a serious condition. It's a lot of words today. So no medical intervention is ever involved until children reach puberty, at which point kids and their parents have to consider, with the help of medical providers and therapists, whether to start puberty blockers, which are designed to simply put puberty on hold. That's what puberty blockers do. And they are extremely safe. And they have almost no side effects, which is really different than a lot of the other meds that are prescribed to kids today. They have been used successfully for over 30 years. 30 years we've been using puberty blockers to help children who experience precocious puberty, which means that they started puberty at 5, 6, 7, some are even younger than that, and allows them to wait for their body to catch up and be ready to actually, their body and brains to catch up and to be actually ready for puberty. So puberty blockers are completely reversible, unlike puberty. So after several years of puberty blockers, generally between the ages 14 and 16, teens decide with the help of professionals whether to start taking hormones that will allow them to experience a puberty that matches their internal understanding of themselves. Nothing about this is experimental. And that's the other thing that is the big talking point right now. All of this is based on established guidelines that have been used for decades. All major medical organizations in the country support life-saving, gender-affirming care for youth, including the American Medical Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and the American Psychiatric Association. All endorse a clear, science-based set of guidelines for youth who are accessing such care. Anyone that claims that gender-affirming care is dangerous or experimental is ignoring the consensus of the entire national medical community. So they're basically saying that climate change doesn't exist. That's the equivalent. Adding insult to injury, almost all state bills and laws that banned gender-affirming care for trans kids in youth include a loophole. And the loophole is for so-called normalizing surgeries for intersex people. Right-wing politicians claim that trans kids are having genital surgeries, which isn't true, but their bills have things on them that allow for medical experimentation. They name bills things like Save Our Kids from Medical Experimentation and banned genital mutilation, yet they are totally fine with intersex children having non-consensual genital surgeries performed on them. Also, in terms of how difficult it is to access care, even before this rash of legislation came down, according to last year's annual report by the Trevor Project, which surveyed 28,000 LGBTQ people ages 13 to 24. 13 to 24, not just teens. Only 11% of the trans and non-binary youth and people that they interviewed reported being on gender-affirming hormones. Only 2% reported taking puberty blockers. So by no means do all trans and non-binary young people want access to medical transition. So this is not something that lots and lots of people are suddenly doing. Fact 4. Trans people are who they say they are. The myth is that loads and loads of people experience transition regret and go back to living as their birth-assigned gender or growing out of being trans. And this is a very common myth that many of you will encounter. The fact is that this is false. There are a couple research studies that anti-trans folks trot out again and again, which have been debunked for using flawed methodology. So one of them studied a large cohort of children who were referred to gender clinics, not children who were actually diagnosed with gender dysphoria. So, for example, there were a lot of parents who took their children to gender clinics, and the providers were like, "Oh, you're a tomboy," but they weren't necessarily feeling that they were the other gender. They just exhibited ideologies, or they showed different gender. Yes. But they were included in the count for who had the transition regret, even though they never really even went into that area. Go off script and you... Other studies have pointed to the incidence of detransition without acknowledging that the majority of the time, the small, very small numbers of people who do go back to living as their birth-assigned gender do so to societal or family pressure. The truth is that trans-related surgeries have some of the lowest incidence of regret of any surgeries out there. So several recent studies have found that incidence of regret is 1% or less. In contrast, the average incidence of regret across all sorts of surgeries is 14%. And up to 30% of people who have knee replacement surgery regret it. So 1% is a cause for celebration. So, last fact. Fact number 5. Trans people are not a threat to cis women. So the idea that trans people, particularly trans women, are a threat to cis women is at the heart of a lot of the anti-trans vitriol. It goes back to the myth that biology dictates who you are, that trans girls and women aren't who they say they are. They are actually boys and men. And boys and men, of course, are unquestionably a threat to women, hence the fake boogeyman of men seeking to enter women's bathrooms, the locker rooms, or sports teams in order to cause harm. Trans people are not a threat to women. Trans people, particularly trans women, disproportionately experience gender-based violence and discrimination themselves. Trans people and women should be natural allies, not antagonists. Patriarchy and attacks on bodily autonomy target both, sometimes simultaneously. Nebraska's recent LB 574, which was passed and signed into law last May, bans gender-affirming care for youth under age 19 and abortions after week 12 in the same bill, all at once. So systematically is designed to divide all of humanity into two groups. Systematically disempower one of them and erase or eradicate anyone who doesn't fit or comply. And today's fight for trans justice is not only tied directly to the fight for reproductive justice, it's also part of the lineage of every women's right movement. This is what it's about. It's about giving people agency to live free and free from gender-based violence. So before I move on, I do want to speak briefly to the particular talking point about the threat of trans girls and women in sports, because this is a huge talking point that I'm sure you will, if you haven't already, encountered, and because it seems logical to a lot of people that trans women would have an advantage in sports. The truth is that they don't. What most people don't realize is that children are indistinguishable in terms of athletic ability prior to puberty. There's no reason, physiology-wise, for girls and boys to play sports separately, and also trans girls who never experience a normative male puberty don't have any advantages. There's no question. They have no advantages over cis girls. In terms of research on trans women who did go through a normative male puberty, there isn't a lot of data, and there's a lot we don't know, and the research that we have is really mixed. And some studies have shown that they retain a small degree of advantage when it comes to certain things. Others have shown that they don't, because after taking estrogen, the physical advantages that a trans woman might have had in comparison with a cisgender woman generally seems to disappear. So it's certainly not the crisis that it's made out to be. At least 16 states across the country have had policies for years that allow trans youth to play high school sports without incident. The NCAA allows trans women to play, and the Olympics does too. And if they can figure it out, it's doable. But the right-wing talking point is that trans people and liberals are ruining women's sports. That doesn't make any sense. If trans women and girls were dominant over cis women and girls in sports, we'd see them winning consistently, but we don't. So this really is a fake threat of trans girls and women in sports, and has ultimate manufactured concern about a non-issue. So what I talked about are the concrete impacts on access to care, access to support of school environment, access to things that improve mental and physical health, like athletics. And those are the concrete things. But what are the side effects of all the anti-trans legislation and rhetoric? Suicide is a stat that is often pointed to because it is so telling, and it's important to know what is going on relative to the impacts of all this. This is from a report that the Trevor Project does every year. So half of trans non-binary young people aged 13 to 24 seriously considered suicide in the last year. Nearly 1 in 5 attempted suicide in the last year. And 27% were physically threatened or harmed in the past year due to their gender identity. I think that the last one's really telling, because this isn't just about actual access, it's about the impact of rhetoric, regardless of where you live. And so we're seeing this uptick in violence and harassment and discrimination. So this slide shows both the bad and the good at once. What this slide shows is that the light pink are cisgender kids and teens, and the next color is trans and non-binary people who have a supportive family, trans and non-binary people who have a neutral family is the next color, and those who have an adverse family is the dark color. That's the term, these are the terms that were used in the study. What this shows is, first of all, the incident of suicide for trans and non-binary young people is wildly higher than it is for cis young people. But having a supportive family or even a neutral family is an enormous protective factor, which is really important. Family is obviously critical, but so are schools, and so are community spaces like congregations. And all these things have a huge impact on suicidality for young queer and trans and non-binary folks. So 42% of trans adolescents living in family environments that are unsupportive of their gender identity attempted suicide by the age of 18. 42%. These are suicide attempts, not just suicidality, thinking about it or considering it. This is a rate that's approximately 8 times as high as cis adolescents. In addition to environments, I would be remiss if I didn't name that a large and growing body of evidence is consistently showing that access to gender-affirming care largely decreases suicidality as well. In a randomly controlled trial on hormone therapy that was just released, found that hormone therapy led to a 55% reduction in suicidality in those receiving care. And another recent study found that initiating hormone therapy in trans youth led to a 14% reduction in actual suicide attempts for trans youth. So all of this has led to an article in the peer-reviewed Lancet journal recently that declared that gender-affirming care should be treated as preventive care for trans people. That's a lot. So this spring, a lot of our adult learning offerings will be about transgender and non-binary issues. Today was the hard facts, and to raise awareness about what is going on in the country. And in a couple weeks, we have a Pronouns 101 class, and next month, we're offering a 6-session series on trans inclusion in our congregations, and it will be offered in person and online. And it is structured so that the first 2 sessions have to do with spiritual grounding and also grounding in the history of our congregations relative to gender and our own gender histories. And the second 2 sessions have to do with gender diversity, learning about gender diversity, learning about the experiences of trans and non-binary folks, and also the spiritual experiences and gifts. And then the final 2 sessions are about culture shift in our congregations. And I think this program is important for all church leaders and congregants to experience, regardless of your knowledge in these issues. And we will be offering it several times over the next year. So, real quick, let's keep going, and we're going to look at UU congregations. In 2019, the Organization of Trans Religious Professionals did a survey in partnership with the UUA and put out a report, and it was really shocking to a lot of people to learn that 72% of trans UUs don't feel like their UU congregations are fully inclusive of them. And that 44% of trans UUs report regularly experiencing trans-related marginalization in UU spaces. So this is really shocking for a lot of folks. And only 15% feel strongly spiritually connected and nourished at their congregation. And if you break this down, only 28% of trans UUs feel like their congregation is fully welcoming and inclusive. And that's the yellow bar. But if you break it down within that, because we all know trans people aren't all the same, we have lots of different experiences. Trans women, 46% of them feel fully included. Trans men, 43% feel fully included. Non-binary people, 18%. That's a big difference. Disabled trans people, 20% versus non-disabled trans people, 39%. People of color who are trans, 15% feel fully included in their congregations, as compared to 30% of white trans people. Raised UUs who are trans, 19% feel fully included versus the not raised UU, 32%. Trans UUs who are least insecure financially, 46% of them feel fully included, versus trans UUs who are most insecure financially, 11%. This says a lot, not just about the experiences of trans people in our churches, but the experience of all people in our congregations relative to how much belonging they feel that they can access. And unfortunately, or just as true things about trans communities, trans folks are more likely to be multiply marginalized than a lot of other folks, particularly other LGBT folks. It is rare for a trans person to not also be queer or disabled or person of color or low income. So what was found in the study that was done in 2019 was that the majority of trans UUs are non-binary. The majority are queer, pansexual, or bisexual, as opposed to straight, lesbian, or gay, or asexual. And the majority of trans UUs who have one or more disabilities, and the majority of trans UUs are young adults, although we do have trans UUs pretty much of every age and stage in our congregations. Compared to the UUs as a whole, trans UUs are far, far more low income. More likely to have been raised a UU, they're younger on average compared to UUs as a whole, and more racially diverse. So what this tells us is that trans UUs and trans people who are drawn to Unitarian Universalism are inhabiting lived experiences that make it extra hard for them to experience belonging in our congregations. So this is a big sidebar to tell you why the last two sessions in the Trans Inclusion in Congregations workshop is focused on culture. Because we strongly believe that in order to be fully welcoming and inclusive and affirming to the trans and non-binary people who desperately need our congregations, we need to grapple with culture and how we are embodying things like the racial diversity, age diversity, pluralism, theological diversity. These are the things that trans UUs need. And for a lot of the folks, oftentimes that thing that creates a sense of unwelcome and a sense of being pushed out of our UU congregations is not explicitly trans-related stuff. For a lot of trans UUs, it's often things like classism and racism and hypocrisy and bullying. So that's what I have for us today. This really wasn't, I'm pushing it all to you. It's not a time for discussion. That 6-session workshop, that is a time for a lot of this discussion. I know that with James Oliver and Hugo, we'll be doing the Pronouns 101 in a couple weeks. They will probably have some Q&A time in there, just because that is a topic that there's a lot of questions. So that will be offered not next Sunday, but the following Sunday, so the 18th. And then the trans inclusion workshops will start in March. Watch for the listings on the Facebook page and email listings. Thank you. Breathe in, breathe out.